The protection of voting rights is a top issue for Democrats who took back the House last fall. Today, a House subcommittee took a field trip to Atlanta to hear testimony from Stacey Abrams, the Georgia Democrat who lost an incredibly close and suspiciously administered race for governor. Abrams still hasn't conceded the race she lost by fewer than 55,000 votes, a race she lost to Republican Secretary of State Brian Kemp, now the governor, the man who ran the entire election process. Instead, Abrams formed a political action committee and filed a lawsuit against state elections officials alleging they grossly mismanaged the 2018 election. Today, she told the House subcommittee what happened in Georgia last fall was nothing short of a systemic effort to suppress the vote.
Incompetence and malfeasance operate in tandem, and the sheer complexity of the state's voting apparatus smooths voter suppression into a nearly seamless system that targets voter registration, ballot access, and ballot counting.
And joining me now is Stacey Abrams. I thought that point you made, blurring the lines between sort of intent and incompetence, was a really interesting one. Elaborate on what your big takeaway from your experience in Georgia was.
So, first of all, thank you for having me tonight. The incompetence lies in the fact that there was poor management of the machines, poor distribution of resources, poor training of electoral workers, and the malfeasance was the purging of voters, the refusal to follow federal rulings that said that exact match the system of kicking out voters, largely people of color, because of typographical errors that could have been made by one of the bureaucrats working for the Secretary of State, that he used systems that were in place to intentionally harm voters. And then he coupled that with an incompetence that left voter information free for hacking, that failed to adequately maintain voter rolls. And these pieces merged together into a system that led to thousands of people being denied the right to vote or facing unconscionable obstacles to casting their ballots.
What do you see as some of the federal solutions here? Obviously, you're testifying before a congressional subcommittee. There's legislation being considered by the Democrats, and there's still a big part of the Voting Rights Act gutted by the Supreme Court that is yet to be restored. What are the solutions you see?
Part of the intent behind the hearings is to lay the foundation for pushing for restoration of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Chief Justice Roberts, in his decision, basically stated there was no proof of racial malfeasance or reason to continue to oversee elections in states like Georgia. So I think part of the intent behind these field hearings is to gather the information and the anecdotal information, but also the testimony to support movement on the Voting Rights Act restoration that Representative Terry Sewell will be leading. But I think the larger issue is making sure that there's a national conversation about voter suppression. H.R. 1 is legislation that was introduced on the first day of this new Congress, and that bill should move forward, particularly those pieces that provide uniformity in how elections are administered. It makes no sense that we have a different democracy, not only in 50 states, but in the state of Georgia in 159 different counties, that depending on the state line or the county line that you cross, your right to vote can be hindered by the act of one person or by an incompetent administration of an entire system.
How much of is it an inherent conflict when you have a Secretary of State who is tasked with administering the state's elections, running himself in a statewide election, like was the case in your race?
I think without question it was not only problematic, it was inherently unfair. Chris Kobach, who would be accused by no one of being a champion of voting rights or of ethical behavior, he stepped down as Secretary of State. And yet the Secretary of State in Georgia not only administered the election, he falsely accused the Democratic Party of hacking to cover up his incompetence the weekend before the election, and he systematically harmed voters over the course of a decade. He was not only the contestant, he was the scorekeeper and the referee, and there is no equitable system that allows that to be so. It was not fair. And that's part of our argument. But what I want to make certain people understand is that my push for fair elections will not solve my immediate issue. I will not become the governor of Georgia simply by pushing this issue. The only thing I can accomplish is making certain that going forward we have fair and just democracy in the state of Georgia and around the country. There's no outcome that makes me the governor on November 6th. And therefore, my only rationale for doing this is to make sure no one else has to face what I faced.
What is the political conversation in your state like in the wake of what happened in that election?
Well, tonight we saw the continuation of a hearing at the state capitol. There's a bill that's been introduced by Republicans that includes a concession on a number of the issues that we raised in this election.
Interesting.
And it was not only standing room only, they had an overflow room for a state legislative hearing. So you know this is an important issue. The challenge here is that there are voting machines that are being sought by the governor, which would reward a company for whom his chief of staff or deputy chief of staff used to work approximately 6 months ago, and that his executive council advised. And so we believe that this is not only bad for Georgia because it's a hackable machine that does not protect the vote, but it's also a procurement nightmare where we're going to see self-enrichment on the state level, similar to what we're watching happen on the federal level.
Wait, I'm sorry, just the voting machine contract to acquire voting machines.
Yes.
To a company that was represented by the deputy chief of staff of the sitting governor 6 months ago?
I believe he was, I want to be fair about how soon. I'll give him a buffer of 6 months. It may have been 6 weeks. But yes, the deputy chief of staff for the sitting governor used to work for the very company that would be awarded a $150 million contract if this procurement process is allowed to move forward.
All right. Well, that raises some questions. I have some questions hearing about that news. Stacey Abrams, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.